What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my rankings for all of the TRPGs I've reviewed, which I believe is 23 of them, mostly because people have asked me to do so after ranking CRPGs, my favorite genre, in a similar manner, and TRPGs are realistically my second favorite genre, which is why I've reviewed so many of them. But I do want to start this video out by mentioning that what's kept me from doing this video previously has just been that I have not reviewed some of the, I would say, big names in this genre, XCOM being the obvious standout, and while I have not reviewed them, I have played them, I'm pretty familiar with them actually, I admit that makes a list like this feel a little incomplete. So my goal with this is rather to set the stage for future TRPG reviews on my part, as I do in fact have a working list of basically every title I want to review, at least as far as old games go, and then obviously new games get added to a separate list that I keep track of, as my job is to review video games. So when I say there's a list, it is a literal list. So I'm making this one now, so in the future, hopefully just later this year in fact, once I've gotten around to reviewing the XCOM series, things like Phoenix Point, Chimera Squad, and some other notable ones, we can double back and see how I wind up feeling about them in comparison to these many others I've reviewed. Otherwise though, I love TRPGs mostly because they often utilize similar systems to CRPGs and instead focus more on the combat, and while there is usually an accompanying story, of course, it tends to be the lesser focus, with the bigger emphasis being on tactics and strategy, which usually incorporates direct combat as well as a management side of things. But as always, genre labels are ambiguous at best, so there's a little bit of give and take back and forth, and one thing you get used to pretty quickly on the internet is that not everyone's going to agree with your opinion about things. But with no further ado, let's actually dive into this, though we will be moving a bit quickly, as if you want my full thoughts, I've reviewed all these games, so by all means, go watch the review. Kicking it off towards the bottom of the list, we have a game that I really didn't like much at all, to be honest with you, and that was Empire of Sin. A game that puts you in the role of a Prohibition-era Chicago gangster. You'll be using that gangster to control all sorts of rackets and criminal enterprises against other players and gangsters. It's a game that mixes things like grand strategy elements with also turn-based tactical engagements, and unfortunately, I would say it just doesn't quite live up to any of those labels. In my own review, I believe I mentioned it as being weaker in every one of those aspects than a similar game of that scope. You'll find better grand strategy games, you'll find better management sims, you'll find better turn-based combat. So it's really hard to enjoy this game unless you just love the aesthetic of it. And while I wouldn't call it the worst thing I've ever played, I just didn't enjoy it much. Which is not a dissimilar situation to our second entry, which is in fact King Arthur, A Knight's Tale. Now this is an interesting one because I think the problem's more me than anything else. I know a lot of people enjoy this one, and since the game has launched back when I reviewed it, they have made some improvements. In fact, there's a standalone expansion launching for it sometime this year that I'll likely check out. King Arthur here is a retelling of Arthurian mythology and legends, with of course dark fantasy trappings, where we'll take on the role of all sorts of knights, managing our base and sending them into the field to fight off various monstrosities. But the reason I didn't like this one is because the progression systems were all wrong. There's a bunch of difficulty spikes because of the way the game handles gear. The end game gets incredibly grindy, and because of those things, it's just not a game I'm overly fond of. Though I admit, again, I'm in the minority on this one. I know a lot of people like it, but it's not for me as it stands. Though when that standalone expansion drops, I'll double back, check it out. Maybe some things have changed and I'll have a different opinion, but at least for now, that's what it is. Next up, however, we have the Lamplighters League, which is a bit of a heartbreaker for me personally, because I enjoy the studio behind it and I enjoy the general premise of this game. I also don't think it was completely without merit, but the Lamplighters League, it felt like, was sent out to die in many respects by its publisher, Paradox Interactive. You see, Harebrained Schemes and Paradox kind of fell out right as this game was launching. And as of right now, Harebrained Schemes is searching for a way to continue business without shutting down, which is the studio behind games like Battletech or the Shadowrun series, which I'm really fond of. But that aside, The Lamplighters League puts you in an alternative history 1930s with sort of noir meets occult vibes. However, the game launched with some performance issues, some balancing issues, and honestly just general lack of big innovations as far as this type of combat goes, so it's not exactly anything to write home about. And now that it's unlikely to ever receive any updates to make it any better, as Harebrained Schemes has made it clear they have put their final patch into it, so this one will remain a case of what could have been, sadly. Right above that, though, we have Iron Danger. I like the premise of Iron Danger, but ultimately it is a small, relatively experimental game, I would say, that focuses on a time manipulation mechanic. It also explores a bit of Finnish fantasy, which is unusual for me at the very least, and while I like this game a fair bit, there's honestly just not much of it to enjoy, as I 100% this one in about 12 hours, for example. So it's cool, I like the general approach they took to combat and manipulating the flow of time, but otherwise there just isn't anything there. Moving right along, however, we then have Othercide. A not dissimilar situation from Iron Danger. It's a pretty good game, I would say, in many ways, but it focuses on a very specific experience and doesn't really offer much else. And unfortunately, that leads to a very grindy end game, though in spite of that, the combat itself is a lot of fun, and the visuals are pretty on point too. Definitely a very striking game in that regard. And if you're looking for something that'll probably run you around the 20-hour range, this is a good one for that. At number 18, however, we then have Circus Electrique, something a little bit different, as it sees us in charge of managing a steampunk circus and engaging in turn-based combat that is similar to Darkest Dungeon. I enjoyed this one quite a bit, however, for its uniqueness, as managing all sorts of circus performers putting on shows at the circus, all while trying to fight off people on the streets of London driven crazy by steampunk inventions, and honestly just some really cool boss fights to top it off, makes for a very fun and unique experience, and is why I still remember it fondly to this day. But I admit it's outshined by others, especially where balance is concerned. This is a game that struggles with balancing the last act or so of the game, which can get out of hand very quickly. In the number 17 spot, however, we then have Wildermyth, an interesting title that's very much so about creating your own story within the framework of the storytelling that they've given you access to. You'll take a group of heroes, follow them over their entire career as they age and change, usually over the course of a story as well, but it also leans pretty heavily on procedural generation, and while a lot of that I think is done pretty well, and will give you events and things based off of individual character stats, and that's to say nothing of the actual TRPG combat that is admittedly a little basic, but still has some fun elements to it, and I think you've got something very unique. Realistically, the only reason I wouldn't put this one higher is because the content gets repetitive pretty quickly, and while that's the kind of thing that can absolutely be addressed by mods to flesh it out more, I just don't think it quite offers enough for people really familiar with the genre. But then we have Tower of Time, a really interesting dungeon crawler style TRPG, and what's more, a real-time with pause one to boot, which are a pretty rare breed. Tower of Time has several unique things going for it, not the least of which is its incredibly good story that they then followed up on in their, I would say, more CRPG release of Dark Envoy. By far the big showstopper of Tower of Time, though, is its combat system that is, of course, real-time with pause, but also sees you using all sorts of abilities that allow you to draw their area of effect, while also using things like positioning to fight off the waves of enemies coming at you from different spawn points, which offers something a bit unique as far as combat experiences in this genre go, which I think is important because honestly, ever since the release of XCOM, a lot of them tend to follow that mold, and anything that breaks it has my attention, which is why I think Tower of Time is definitely worth taking a look at, though it is admittedly a pretty janky game by comparison to many others on this list. Cracking the top 15, we then have the DioField Chronicle. Another interesting game that does a lot of interesting things, I would say, but most importantly, it's another real-time with pause game, or real-time tactical battle as the game likes to call it, and the main thing that held it back for me initially, honestly, was that it was incredibly easy. Like, if you're familiar with these kinds of games at all, you would likely just roll over the DioField Chronicle. And in response to that, they did add a harder difficulty mode later, which I think plays a little better, especially when you start taking into account for things like the maps and how you approach individual things. But ultimately, I would say this game is still a little lower on the list simply because it stopped short of really what it needed to be great. In some ways, I would say this one is also a bit experimental, and if they got around to refining some of these core systems, I think they could be onto something. But in any event, it's certainly a unique game, and I had a fair bit of fun playing with it, even if it still does have a few problems. Moving right along, though, we then have Hard West 2, sequel, of course, to Hard West, though by a different developer. This is a TRPG imagining of a supernatural Wild West that sees us trying to catch up with a ghost train to reclaim our souls. One thing I really liked about this game was its progression system is tied to assembling different poker hands by finding cards around the map and earning them from missions. And the better poker hand you assign to a player, the more abilities and things they get, which I thought was cool. And the devs were very responsive to the initial rounds of feedback this game got, which means a lot of its initial issues were polished out. Really, the only thing I would say holding it back is that it was a little too on the puzzle side of the tactics genre. See, some TRPGs in general are a bit like a puzzle. There's a right way or a wrong way to approach them and sort of crack the case, as it were, and initially out of the gate, Hard West 2 leaned into that pretty hard with things like mission timers on a certain difficulty that required you thus to complete the mission in a certain way. But in any event, I think Hard West 2 is a lot of fun, and the combat really revolves around trying to maximize your turns by utilizing the bravado system, I believe it's called off the top of my head, to earn extra action points and keep on attacking. But it's a game where once you've figured out the general gist of how combat goes, you've pretty much solved the game. Which is also kind of the case for our halfway mark, more or less, which is Mutant Year Zero. A TRPG with a pretty big emphasis on stealth and taking out enemies and prepping the battlefield before you actually jump into it, Mutant Year Zero puts you in the role of a few different mutant animals, as it were, who are living in a post-apocalyptic world beset by a few problems that naturally would like to solve. Now, the management side of this one comes down to managing your consumables, managing your weaponry, mainly your silent weaponry so you can take out enemies, solving the sort of combat puzzles you'll be getting into, that is to say, picking off which enemies you can before entering combat and setting yourself up for success before the battle even starts. And because of that, this is another one that falls into the sort of tactics puzzle side of things, which means how you can approach any given situation is a bit rigid, but otherwise it's a cool setting, it's a cool premise, but it's definitely a slower paced game due to the stealth. In the number 12 spot, we then have Triangle Strategy, a game that's a little more on the story side than the combat side, as it were. And luckily, the story is pretty decent, and the combat itself is quite good, being based on all sorts of companions and party members you may or may not see, depending on the route you took through the game. There's multiple different endings based on what you choose, which is where the story-heavy part of it comes in, which can then lead to different battles and boss fights even. And that part of it is pretty fun. Now, the downside to Triangle Strategy, for me at least, is that when I say it's heavy on the story, I mean it's probably a little too heavy on the story. There are times where there is like an hour or so of cutscene and dialogue before you get to a fight. And as I recall, in my first impressions video for this one, I mentioned that in the first 2 to 3 hours, there was only about 1 or 2 fights. So much so that they kind of had to pad it out and give you a chance to train via extra optional missions you could take on that don't really have much to do with the story. But it's the kind of game that I wish they would have done a little less talking and a little more fighting sometimes, but otherwise I did have a lot of fun with it. Getting close to the top 10 now with Marvel's Midnight Suns. Now this is a polarizing one, both for people at large and honestly myself too, because I love the combat side of this game, and then the base management, which includes this sort of friendship simulator with all of the Marvel heroes, is just incredibly boring. But the reason it still manages to be decently high up on this list is because the combat is a lot of fun, and while it is technically a deck builder in some ways, it's not as random as you might initially think, and you still, through the use of more basic actions always available to your character, regardless of what cards they've drawn that turn, have a decent amount of control over the battlefield, which is great because the combat of this game is a ton of fun, to the point where I'm willing to overlook how annoying the in-between parts are, where you're just chatting up various superheroes, learning about their backgrounds, and just generally befriending them in a mansion, which I'm sure some people will enjoy, but it just wasn't for me. And while I went into it expecting expecting to hate the combat system because I'm not usually one for card mechanics. It really did surprise me, but given the developer of this one, Firaxis, is the developer behind the actual XCOM games, maybe that shouldn't have been such a surprise. In any event though, if only for the combat, I do think you should check it out, preferably when it's on sale though, like it is right now for 75% off for instance. I do think its full price of $60 is a little much. Hitting the number 10 spot, we then have Warhammer 40k Mechanicus, a TRPG putting us in the role of the Adeptus Mechanicus of the Warhammer 40k universe, whom we'll be utilizing to take on Necrons in battles across a specific planet as they begin to wake up. A little on the shorter side, this game won't necessarily run you a particularly long time. It does feature a ton of fun combat mechanics and a lot of great boss fights that then lead to a final boss fight against potentially the final boss plus all the other bosses you didn't manage to defeat along the campaign, which can lead to some epic moments. Now, realistically, I think the only problem I have with this game really is that it's another case of once you've figured out the combat system and how to break it, it becomes pretty trivial from there even on the higher difficulties. Otherwise though, a lot of fun and a great way to learn about the Adeptus Mechanicus even. Though that brings us to number 9, which is called Miasma Chronicles from the developers behind Mutant Year Zero. We have a similarly styled game, structurally speaking. It is much the same in its approach to combat, and in between, however, it improves on and learns a great deal from their prior work, which allows for more options and approaches to any given situation. And coupled with a really interesting story, I liked Miasma Chronicles quite a bit. Though if you aren't familiar with Mutant Year Zero and how they approach making these games, you might struggle a little bit until you figure it out. Then at number 8, we have Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, which is, first and foremost, way too long of a name. Chaos Gate puts you in the role of the Grey Knights, however, space marines who get roped into dealing with all sorts of plagues brought about by Nurgle, and while this was a great game on launch, it's actually been expanded upon by some of its DLCs, giving you more types of marines and more types of enemies and missions to fight. This is another one I was playing while trying to learn more about the Warhammer 40k universe, and it's as over the top and combat heavy as you would certainly expect from something like that, and the game itself can be fairly challenging, though realistically this one is very similar to XCOM itself, as honestly a lot of TRPGs are, though this one can be a significant challenge until you get your bearings at least, but not having to deal with hit chance and using its precision targeting system to attack certain limbs, things like that, knock parts off of enemies which then disable certain attacks for instance, are just one of the reasons I enjoyed this game as much as I did, though realistically I do think it can get a bit repetitive towards the end as a lot of the mission types and things don't really change. But that is helped along by some really memorable fights with certain bosses which have unique mechanics that you have to watch out for, and once you kind of figure out how to approach it, it can be a ton of fun, which is what it's doing so far up. But then we have Lost Eidolons. While I don't really have any Fire Emblem on the list, Lost Eidolons is however pretty close to that, which is certainly a nice change from all of the XCOM comparisons I'm sure, but seeing how you can't get Fire Emblem for PC, that's reason enough to check out Lost Eidolons if you want something like that. But what I like most about Lost Eidolons is the mission variety it brings to the table. You're often trying to do certain things around different types of maps, and then there's the monster fights you can get into, which function a bit differently than fighting off regular enemies, and that's before you get into recruiting certain troops who all have their own upgrade paths and can specialize in things, which can then be better or worse against other types of troops, which makes for a fun combat loop. That, combined with its relatively low fantasy, dark and gritty setting, makes for a game that I enjoyed quite a bit, which is what it's doing up here. Getting close to the top now, though, we then have Wartales, a fantastic game that does a lot of different things, a bit different than some of the other games on this list to be sure. Wartales puts you in the role of a mercenary company that's going to travel throughout the land, several provinces in fact, tackling local problems which all have their own local stories you can take part in and take sides in, which all comes together to form the overall story of your mercenary band. And you're going to handle things like upgrading their gear, feeding them, paying them, managing their camp, and all sorts of other side activities you can get up to throughout the land. And that's before you get into the actual combat, which has a lot of fun abilities and a sort of morale system that affects your team's abilities that you can dive into. And then there's their recent pirate expansion that puts you in charge of a ship and managing a pirate crew potentially if you want, which is certainly not a direction I expected the game to go. But all in all, it's a pretty ambitious game that does a lot of things, and it does many of them very well. Really, the only thing that keeps this from being higher on the list for me in particular is that I wish there was a more cohesive narrative. All the provinces that you'll be in, or the counties, have their own stories going on, and you'll get involved there, but there is no set ending to the game really. You just kind of run out of things to do and you're done when you're done. And that's not going to be for everybody, but otherwise a very enjoyable game. Cracking the top 5, we now have Showgunners. Running Man the TRPG puts us on a deadly dystopian future game show where contestants fight for their lives, and we're going to take on a team of contestants trying to do just that in a short and sweet, really fun TRPG. Mostly because the show part of it isn't underdone. These are actual levels you'll be running through, which involves you solving all sorts of exploration puzzles before engaging in various ambush type combat encounters, or more set ones, as you move through the game show itself. The progression system involves signing sponsors for things, which I thought was funny, and then the combat itself is quite well done, and the mix of all those things together is handled exceptionally well, and it makes for what feels like a really complete experience, even if it's really on the shorter side. It's a ton of fun, and I wish I could play more of it, frankly. Coming in at the number 4 spot, we then have Aliens Dark Descent, another real-time with pause TRPG set in, of course, the Aliens franchise, and it does a lot of really unique things. Probably the best thing about it is that it manages to maintain that sort of suspenseful feel of horror as you move through and try to contend with all these aliens, as you seek to neutralize a threat to a planet after an outbreak. It's a TRPG that manages to make you feel like you're never fully in control, even if you know what you're doing, and it's definitely one of the harder TRPGs I can say that I've played and beaten. And it has all the, I would say, hallmarks of the genre, where you're going to have to contend with a base management system that sees you taking care of all of your Marines, who can deal with the psychological trauma of being in their situation as they try to fight their way out of it. And then there's the mechanics around the hive itself and how they come at you. And Aliens Dark Descent does so many unique things in a really fun way at the same time that it draws you in and gets its hooks into you, which is what made it so memorable for me. Unfortunately, there are some persistent bugs, and I don't mean the aliens in here, that make it a little hard to recommend completely out of the gate, but that, combined with how hard it is, at least anyway, it is still a very fun and unique experience, and I do think people should try it. Coming in at the number 3 spot, though, we then have Tactics Ogre Reborn, a remake of Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together, a much-loved classic. The best things about it are realistically the combat depth, everything down to recruiting all sorts of different characters and monsters and then assigning them different classes and then getting a build together for them. And it also features several different paths through the game based on the choices you'll make throughout the story, which as always leads to unique content. And while some of the changes they made to make it a more approachable title have not been universally well received, let's say, I still think they did a great job with the remake overall, and it would be a little bit higher if it weren't for the level cap the game imposes, making it, honestly, I think a little more difficult than it really needs to be. And I'm not sold on these buff cards that drop into battle either, so not exactly the top of the list, but I did have my fun with it. Coming in at number 2, though, we then have Jagged Alliance 3. Sequel, of course, to Jagged Alliance 2, a bit of a cult classic. Jagged Alliance 3 is one of those games that I would say is almost a CRPG. There's a ton of different side stories. You can approach them in multiple different ways to get different outcomes to affect the overall future for the country of Grand Chien, a fictional place where our mercenary band here is operating, though it's worth mentioning that this game is meant to be sort of satire of 80s B movies, so all of it is very over the top. Though I will say it's mostly up this high simply because of just how much fun it is. You can have a blast in combat, and the story is quite good at the same time, especially as you're making those choices and trying to solve or figure out at least different problems. So while I wouldn't say the combat is incredible or anything, especially in the late game, I think a lot of it can devolve into simple sniper rifle fights, if I'm being honest, as they almost always hit and they deal incredible damage. Looking at the total experience, I had just a ton of fun playing Jagged Alliance 3, which is why it's so high up. It's simply a very enjoyable experience, which can't always be said for games that can get a little tedious, especially towards the end. But nonetheless, that brings us to the number 1 spot. So what could that possibly be? It is none other than Troubleshooter, Abandoned Children. Simply put, one of the most impressive TRPGs, which is even more shocking when you find out that it is in fact a indie title by a small company and the game itself is like $20. This game puts you in the role of a crew of vigilantes protecting the city of Valhalla, and while the story can certainly be a little bit hard to follow at times, as it tends to bounce around with unconnected events, the combat and the character building are very, very good. In fact, there are entire systems dedicated to just one specific character and how they approach combat, such as taming beasts for one of them and building robots for another. And then there's the interesting ocean that is the mastery system that sees you mixing and matching certain masteries, as they're called, to form bonuses based on what you have equipped to a given character, which forms their build of sorts. And while there are certainly meta choices there, it's a surprisingly deep system with a lot of mechanical complexity if you want it. But if I'm being real with you, I like this game for much the same reason I like Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. It is flush with deep, complicated systems that take a lot to get your head around and master, but once you do, it's a really satisfying experience. Now, unfortunately, that does create a bit of a barrier to entry, so I think it can be a lot to get into, as this game is pretty demanding of your time if you want to get into everything it has to offer, as some mechanics don't even show up until very late into your playthrough, which is saying something when the game regularly comes out at like 80 to 100 hours for just the story. But it's a $20 game you could spend hundreds of hours with, has incredibly deep systems that are in some cases specific to individual characters, and it just has so much to offer. It's definitely a game I would consider a must-play for the genre, and while it certainly has its faults, the English localization isn't all that great if I'm being honest, and again, bit of a barrier to entry. But if you are okay with those things, I think it's a tremendous game and it easily earns the top spot here, which is why I've spent like 200 hours with it, which is probably why it's my 10th most played game on Steam. But that finally brings us to the end of this particular list. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I'm curious to see what everybody makes of all of these titles individually, and I'm very curious to know what TRPGs you'd like me to review in the future for when I wind up redoing this list, to include, I would say, the bigger greats as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, such as the XCOM series obviously, but also some smaller titles releasing this year such as Capes or Beast. But in any event, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.